tonight. I am both your presenter and your bartender tonight. So thank you. Thank you. All right, well, my real job here at Brucemore is I'm the curator of museum collections. My name is Jessica, and I'm excited to welcome you all here to our third installment of Mansion Mixers. This has been a really fun program for us to do, and I'm going to do a short presentation around 15 minutes or so tonight about puzzles and poltergeists, spooky stuff. And this presentation, I'm going to share about how we kind of get from the puzzle part to the poltergeist part and connect all of that and what it's got to do with Brucemore and why we're talking about it here. But really, we've got a lot of things happening in the story. We've kind of got it all. We're going to talk about bookbinding, decorative bookbinding. We're going to talk about puzzles, of course. We're going to talk about communing with the dead. So that's going to be our spoopy part of the presentation. We're going to talk about women's rights. It's Women's History Month after all, so we've got to do that. And then at the very end, to round out the evening, I've got questionable health advice for you. So we're going to follow up with that. All right, but the whole story really revolves around Irene Douglas here at Brucemore. She's our favorite lady here. She is the person who really the whole Brucemore story kind of revolves around. She was born in Jamestown, New York in 1870 to a prominent family of doctors there, but grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Moved here to Cedar Rapids in 1892 when she married George Bruce Douglas, heir to part of the Quaker Oats fortune and entrepreneur with Douglas Starch Works. Started a family together, and she is the HBIC of the Douglas family. She is running the show. She's got a lot on her plate. She is a very, very, very busy woman. She's raising her 3 daughters, of course, with the help of some servants. She is one of Cedar Rapids' most prominent philanthropists. She is also an big arts and culture supporter here, but she is still making time to pursue her passions, which include gardening, raising exotic chickens, golfing, and most importantly, decorative bookbinding. So she is an artiste. So what is decorative bookbinding? Sometimes when I mention that, people get a little blank face. They don't really quite know what that means. But basically, decorative bookbinding is the process of building a book. You can either do that with your own hands, or it can be done through modern production with automated machinery. But it involves several areas of craft. You are binding the book, doing the leatherworking and the gilding and the stamping on it. Sometimes it involves making the paper yourselves or doing some printmaking. So there's a lot of different elements to creating just a single volume of books. The arts and crafts movement, which was very popular at the kind of turn of the 20th century, encouraged handcrafting as kind of a rejection of industrialization in design. And it's also being promoted as a popular hobby or even a career for women. The Guild of Women Bookbinders, founded in England in 1898, promotes it being something that women can do. In fact, he says that he maintained that women were well suited to be bookbinders due to their inborn reverence for the beautiful and their deftness of hand. So Irene must have agreed with that, and she thought it would be a suitable hobby for her. And so how did she become a bookbinder? She was traveling a lot in her younger years, saw some decorative bookbinding being done in Florence, Italy on one of her visits, and kind of fell in love with the craft. She thought that that was something that she could do, so she studies at the very famous Elephant Bindery in New York City. That was run at the time by a woman named Florence Foote, who became her kind of primary first teacher. So she's taught by these bookbinding legends in the time. She would often spend several weeks a year in New York City doing her bookbinding. And she did it so much and spent so much time on it that she needed a space here at Brucemore to do that. So she built her own bookbindery here in 1912, and then eventually even converts a 3rd floor room of the mansion into a bookbinding annex between 1924 and 1929. So it was something that she felt really, really passionately about. And she probably had the only private bindery west of Chicago at that time period. And that's Irene back in the corner there working in one of her binderies. So that's her doing her craft right there.
What sort of books was she binding?
Good question. Her own, someone else's books, most of them were Shakespeare or kind of antique gem works and classics. Yep, all that kind of stuff. But she would also make scrapbooks and photo albums and diaries and things like that. So it's kind of a mixture of things. And so her love of bookbinding is really what brings in the second person into this story that kind of connects all these crazy themes together, and that is a woman named Helen Haskell Noyes. She is a bookbinder, a puzzle maker, and a spiritualist. And there's another kind of secondary woman in this story, Emily Preston, who is a very close friend of Helen's, and they kind of go together. So we'll also talk a little bit about her as well. So they start to get to know each other probably around 1901. Emily was born in 1867, originally from Chicago, studied in England first, and then came back to the US, came to New York around 1900 and started her own bindery. Helen is born in 1864, originally from Maine. Also travels to New York and starts working in bookbinding. But she had traveled quite a bit like Irene had. Her father, his name was Charles Courtney Haskell, and he will be important later, so remember that her father is a publisher. And he was pretty well-to-do. That afforded Helen the ability to kind of pursue her art. She didn't have to kind of really work for a living if she didn't want to. So Irene met Helen, I'm sorry, I'm going to say Ellen and Helen interchangeably a lot because we have an Ellen Douglas a lot. So this is, my tongue's going to slip up. But Helen probably gets to know Irene right around 1901 when they start working at the bindery together, and they probably meet Emily in that same time period. But Helen and Emily really start a friendship that endured for the rest of their lives. They worked together in Emily's bindery and were founding members of the Guild of Bookworkers in 1906. They traveled together and they even lived together for a period, though Helen was married from 1911 to 1921. And the photos that you see here on the slide are of Emily's studio, which this one I believe was her studio at 223 East 17th Street in Grand Mercy Park in New York City. And this is probably where Helen, see I did it again, Helen, Emily, and Irene were probably spending a lot of time practicing their craft there. Helen gets involved in another artistic craft, and that craft is puzzles. And so she picks up puzzles probably right around 1910 when there is kind of an emergence of puzzles gaining popularity here in the US. The first American puzzles were produced around the Civil War, but they started kind of gaining popularity. They were being mass-produced by this point, but there were small producers like Helen that were taking just images that they would see in a book or in a print that they would purchase someplace, and then they would put them on some wood and then cut them with a jigsaw. So that's how they were making these puzzles. These early puzzles were not interlocking, so they didn't have pieces that fit together tightly. So you just kind of had to push to fit them together. That made them pretty tricky. If you bumped your table, all of a sudden your work is all undone. And often you didn't get a picture, so you didn't know what the image was that you were aiming for. So that's fun. And remember that for later. And we know that the Douglas daughters were doing Helen's puzzles. They received their first one around 1915. That's the first time Margaret mentions one of them in her diaries. So these are a couple of examples of some of Helen's puzzles that are part of our collection. One of them is on display on the second floor, so make sure you check that out if you haven't seen that already. The other one we usually display during the holiday season. But you can see that these puzzles are pretty well loved, right? They're missing some pieces. And so that means, they were doing these puzzles, and that's what happens when you do a puzzle a bunch. You lose the pieces. And many early puzzle makers distinguished their work by creating a custom shaped piece. The piece that you can see here, I've got circled, is right here, and it's kind of a floral shaped piece, and these were called Mayflower puzzles. So that was one of the styles that she made, but then she made a second style of puzzle with a custom shape, and she chose maybe poorly for her other custom shape. She chose the swastika. Yeah, yikes. But let me explain that a little bit. Yeah, the meaning was different at that point, yes. So you can imagine my surprise, though, the first time I opened the box that had these in these, and I see all of these puzzles in them. But there's context here. The symbol has a lot of different meaning. So before it was adopted by the National Socialist Party or the Nazi Party, it was a fairly common symbol, especially kind of in the 1920s in the US. Swastikas were popular symbologies through a lot of cultures through the world, especially here in the North American continent. You see it a lot in indigenous tribes, but also in Eurasian cultures as well. So You can see here a couple of images that I found. Orientalism was a kind of popular trend in design and fashion in the 1920s, and the swastika was seen a lot in that design feature. So that's American actress Clara Bow with a big swastika on her hat. And then you also see American aviator Matilda Massant here wearing a swastika on her jumpsuit because swastikas were considered to be a symbol of good luck. So it would be very appropriate that a person who was flying a very dangerous early airplane would choose a swastika to wear on her outfit. But by the time mid-1930s rolls around, by the time it's adopted by the Nazis, for the most part, it gets kind of thoroughly discarded by most Americans, and especially after World War II. Helen passes away in 1940, so she probably never got a lot of pushback for having a swastika, but it did change the way that her puzzles are collected. A lot of antique puzzle collectors won't collect her pieces, and it also makes it difficult for us, who has a large collection of these puzzles, to display them, because you have to give a lot of context for people to be able to understand why they are there. So I thought this was a good time to share, because you guys get the full explanation. But that kind of brings us to the last portion of our experience here together, and that's spirits. We're going to talk a little bit about spiritualism. Now, if you were hoping for poltergeists, there's no poltergeist, I'm sorry. We did that for alliteration, so sorry. But we are going to talk about communing with the spirits. So when I say spiritualism, do people kind of know what that means or have heard of it a little bit? So it's a popular religious movement in the US in the 19th and 20th centuries. It's a belief that basically your consciousness continues on out of your body after you die, and that the living can contact the dead. The spirits also can continue to kind of evolve in the afterlife. So they can give you advice if you contact them, and they can kind of continue to grow. And spiritualism is really common in the US in a couple of different periods. One is following the American Civil War, massive loss of life. People are trying to kind of grapple with that. So it's very comforting, right, to think that you can talk to your lost loved ones. It comes out of the upper part of New York, the burned over district, which you might have heard of a lot in your American history classes way back in the day. But the first American mediums that are reported begin in 1848. It's the Fox sisters of New York who report that they can communicate with the spirit of a peddler who was supposedly murdered in their house. And their spirit communication came through rapping. And I don't mean like rapping like we think of it today. I mean like unexplainable knocks and popping sounds. So that's how the spirits were communicating with them. And friends of the Fox sisters believed them. They thought that they were communicating with the spirits. And so they started promoting their abilities. And it was very a progressive religious movement because it was very individualistic. It kind of moved away from the church. And it was also opened up some possibilities for women. Women were the primary mediums, the ones who the spirits were talking to. So it attracted a lot of very radical thinkers during those days. But mediumship demonstrations were very popular, widely attended by women and upper class women and kind of middle class women especially. And like I already mentioned, very popular in the Civil War, and then experiences another resurgence in the 1920s, or kind of around the World War I era, right? When there's another massive loss of life. And so people are kind of grappling with this. And that's where Helen and Emily come into spiritualism. They read a very popular book at the time called Raymond, Life and Death by Oliver Lodge, which was precisely about the thing we just talked about. His son had passed away during World War I, and he was communicating with the spirit of his son. And we know that Irene also read this book because there's a copy of it in our library. We don't know how she felt about it, though, unfortunately. But Ellen and Emily, Emily and Helen began talking with the spirits first through a Ouija board, and you can see a spirit board up here in the corner. So that was how they started with it, but then it progressed into automatic writing, which was this trance writing, where they didn't consciously take any words in, the spirit was supposedly just flowing through them, and it gets written out. And so they took all of those writings and turned it into a book. Remember, her father was a publisher, so they can publish books very easily. And they published a book called The Voice from Space in 1920. Unfortunately, none of the spirits that they communed with were editors. And this book is a real rough read. It's very challenging to read. You can read it if you'd like, though. It is available on Internet Archive. And both women channeled some very interesting thoughts. So I thought we would kind of wrap up by showing you some of the things that they channeled. So Emily's communications are a little bit more in line with kind of spiritualist beliefs. Spiritualism and reformism went together very well. We talked a little bit about how it's a kind of progressive form of religion. And a lot of early abolitionists, suffragists were people who were also spiritualists. They go together very well. And so just a few of the causes that spiritualists were involved with: socialism, abolition, non-resistance, women's rights, anti-oath taking and office holding, temperance, vegetarianism, anti-tobacco and caffeine leagues, and basically every other type of reform that requires the practice of a higher life. And Emily's beliefs really fall into that. Also, keep in mind that they published this book in 1920. It's the same year that the 19th Amendment is ratified. So suffrage is right at the top of a lot of people's minds. And so she writes a lot about women and the experience of power. And so I wanted to read this quote here that she wrote in the book. "So men filled with will to rule, who have wished women to be lesser agents in life's great causes than they. Sometimes it is the sole chance for power a man has, that to rule his wife. His love is killed when this aim is first. He has lost the great companionship of love." So she's clearly a women's rights activist, right? Could have used some editing, though. This is not a very clear sentence, so, we'll work on that. Helen's thoughts, though, are not quite as lofty as Emily's thoughts were. Her communications deal largely with health. And suspiciously, the spirit that she was communicating with suggests remedies that sound an awful lot like the ones that her father held. So, I don't know, seems kind of suspicious. As I mentioned earlier, I told you her father was a publisher. In 1901, he published a book called Perfect Health: How to Get It and How to Keep It. And you can see over here on the slide. And by one who has it. So, yeah, he's got it. He's got it figured out. This book advocates for Edward Hooker Dewey's method of therapeutic fasting as a cure for literally everything. Unsurprisingly, Haskell was Dewey's publisher, and so it all kind of makes sense, right? So let's talk a little bit about what Dewey's beliefs were that Helen's dad was promoting. First one, no breakfast. That's something that we still hear occasionally, right? Intermittent fasting is a thing, right? So that's not that out of left field, right? Only eat when natural hunger occurs. Again, advice that we still, yep. Sometimes, Third thing, chew food until all flavor is gone. So, yeah, just chewing and chewing and chewing. And then the last one, so remember you're just chewing and chewing and chewing, no liquids at meals. So you're just dry swallowing all of that chewed food. Very unpleasant. And then step 5, you've achieved perfect health. Congratulations. That's all there is to it. So basically, he believed that fasting would cure everything. And so all of these beliefs actually, believe it or not, make it into Helen's communication with the spirits. So something is telling me this maybe wasn't a spirit communicating this to her. I don't know, suspicious. In fact, we know that Irene had a copy of this book, probably given to her by Helen, given to her in 1901, first time she meets Helen, right after they had been spending time in New York doing bookbinding. She gets back here to Cedar Rapids, immediately tries the no breakfast thing. She writes about it in her diary. So she's like, yeah, I'm trying this no breakfast thing. I made breakfast for Margaret, didn't eat any breakfast myself. About a week later, though, she stops mentioning it altogether. So see, people in history are just like us, right? We have that one friend who's like, I'm trying this crazy diet, you should try it too. And then, yeah, it just goes in the trash can. But that's really about it. That kind of concludes my presentation for the evening. Hopefully was able to connect these kind of crazy topics for you. But any questions about anything that I just mentioned or anything you're curious about? Okay, if you don't have,
Seances here? Oh, yeah.
I got that question in the last presentation too. Not that we're aware of, but it would not surprise me if there were probably some. We do know that Mihaela, who was Irene's sister-in-law, did have a Ouija board that was part of her estate when she passed away. So she might have been a little bit more into it than maybe Irene and the girls were, but I could see them maybe doing it.
The natural next question is, what about ghost encounters?
Here at Brucemore?
Yeah.
I am not receptive to those experiences, I don't think, but I've had a lot of people say that they kind of feel energies and things in the house, and we did have people who passed away in the house, but it was never anything traumatic or scary or anything. It was all very natural deaths, but, you know, so some people say they feel things when they come here, so, and who am I to say that they're wrong?
Was there any record of like the people who lived here, like experiencing anything?
Yes, that's a good question. So Ellen, who is the middle Douglas daughter, was a writer, and she writes in her book, When We Went First Class, which was kind of a memory of growing up here at Brucemore and also kind of a travel book. She wrote that she saw a ghost in the library. So she said that she experienced something here, but the thing to remember about Ellen is that everybody always said that she never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So we don't know how much of that is kind of embellished for her effect, but she said that she experienced something here. Yeah, good questions.
But no one's reporting opening, the doors opening and closing this.
No. Yeah.
I have a question about
Yeah.
puzzles.
Yeah.
Why was it designed in such a way? Like when did it switch to become the jigsaw puzzle?
Oh, the interlocking. That really is more kind of a byproduct of them being mass produced. So when they're being made by these bigger companies, and the interlocking piece just makes them easier to assemble, right? So they don't kind of just completely fall apart when you're putting them together. So it's really kind of early 20th century, right around the 1930s, when they're really becoming popular, that you start to see those interlocking puzzles.
And in that regards, was there any other games that she developed since she was was it Helen?
Helen, yeah.
That was a puzzler, or was it mainly puzzles?
Mainly puzzles. Yep, that's the only thing I've ever found from her.
Thank you.
Yeah, good questions. All right, well, I'll turn you loose. Remember, there's going to be some more activities tonight, including some puzzling. So keep that in mind. And yeah, thank you guys for coming down. Yeah.
Let's go, right?